The arrogant CEO laughed at the filthy beggar, completely unaware that the ragged old man actually owned the entire bank. Humiliating the poor man was his final mistake. The ultimate instant karma was about to brutally crush the billionaire.
The deafening sound of heavy wooden gavel striking mahogany podium echoed like a cannon blast to the massive vaulted ceilings of the grand Elias auction house. It was the most exclusive and heavily guarded financial institution in the entire city of place, where only the top 1% of the global elite were ever allowed to set foot. Outside the massive stained glass windows, a brutal winter, freezing rainstorm was battering the streets, but inside the atmosphere was warm, glowing, and suffocatingly arrogant. The room was filled with the wealthiest mega billionaires on the planet, all wearing million-dollar custom diamond, encrusted watches, and flawless bespoke Italian silk suits that cost more than most people's entire homes. In the dead center of the front row, sitting in a plush crimson velvet chair, sat 35-year-old Julian Vance, the most ruthless and merciless tech mogul in the state. Julian was wearing a sharp, tailored midnight blue tuxedo, his dark hair perfectly slicked back, as he swirled a glass of extremely expensive vintage champagne with a cruel, sadistic smirk on his face. He had spent his entire life crushing innocent people, dismantling small businesses, and destroying lives just to add a few more zeros to his offshore bank accounts. He believed that poor people were nothing more than disgusting insects meant to be crushed under his expensive Italian leather shoes, and he absolutely loved humiliating anyone who dared to defy him. Today, Julian was here for one specific reason. He had just placed a $50 million bid on the most valuable and historic piece of real estate in the entire district known as the Harbor Workshops. The workshops were beautiful century-old red brick buildings that housed dozens of struggling local artisans and families. Julian did not care about the history or the families living there. He just wanted to demolish the entire block to construct another massive, lifeless glass skyscraper for his megacorporation, just to feed his massive ego. The wealthy auctioneer standing on the stage adjusted his expensive gold-rimmed glasses, wiping a bead of sweat from his forehead as he looked down at Julian with absolute reverence and fear. "I have $50 million from Mr. Vance," the auctioneer announced, his voice booming over the surround sound microphone system. "I have $50 million going once, I have $50 million going twice." Julian took a slow sip of his champagne, smiling wickedly at the other billionaires in the room, who were too terrified of his ruthless reputation to dare and outbid him. But just before the auctioneer could bring the heavy wooden gavel down to finalize the devastating sale, a calm, gravelly voice pierced through the dead silent opulent room. $55 million, the voice stated calmly, neither shouting nor begging, but speaking with an absolute lethal authority that made the crystal chandeliers above seem to vibrate. The entire room, full of arrogant billionaires, collectively gasped in pure shock and whipped their heads around toward the back of the glowing auction hall. Standing near the heavy brass double doors flanked by massive security guards was a 65-year-old man named Elias. Elias was not wearing a custom tuxedo, a designer tie, or a diamond watch. He was wearing a ragged, damp gray wool coat that smelled strongly of the freezing rain pouring outside. His heavy combat boots were scuffed and covered in thick street mud, completely ruining the pristine red carpet beneath him. His hands were bare, heavily calloused, and covered in deep, jagged combat scars and burn marks that told the story of a man who survived absolute hell. Elias was a retired Tier 1 combat veteran who had bled for his country in the darkest corners of the globe, but to the elite snobs sitting in this room, he looked like a disgusting homeless beggar who had somehow wandered in off the freezing streets to escape the storm. Julian Vance lowered his champagne glass so fast that some of the expensive liquid spilled onto his wrist. His cruel smirk instantly twisted into a look of pure, unadulterated disgust as he looked the old man up and down. He turned around in his velvet chair and glared at Elias like he was looking at a piece of rotting garbage. "What in the world is the meaning of this, Julian?" demanded, his arrogant voice echoing harshly through the hall. "Security guards, why is there a filthy, ragged vagrant trespassing in this building? Grab him and throw this trash out into the gutter, where he belongs, before he ruins the scent of my champagne with his miserable existence." Two massive, heavily muscled security guards, wearing black suits and tactical earpieces, immediately rushed toward Elias. They grabbed the old man's shoulders roughly with their thick hands, intending to drag him out into freezing rain and beat him in the alleyway. But Elias did not flinch, he did not panic, and he did not resist. He just stood there like an unmovable mountain of solid, impenetrable granite. His heart rate did not even spike. He held up a small, crumpled, faded photograph in his scarred hand. It was a picture of his late wife, Mary, standing smiling in front of those exact harbor workshops over 40 years ago on the day they met. Those brick buildings held the only beautiful memories he had left of her, and he was absolutely not going to let a ruthless, arrogant little tech mogul demolish them just to inflate his bank account. "Take your hands off me," Elias whispered, his gravelly voice dropping to a frequency so low and dangerous that the two massive security guards instantly froze in pure primal terror, realizing in a fraction of a second that they were not grabbing a week-old beggar. They were grabbing a walking, sleeping apex predator. Elias calmly raised his worn wooden bidding paddle, again his scarred hand completely steady in the air. "I said $55 million, Elias repeated, looking directly past the guards and locking his dead cold eyes on the terrified auctioneer on the stage. Julian Vance stood up from his plush crimson velvet seat, so fast that his expensive champagne glass shattered on the pristine red carpet. His face, which was usually composed in a mask of arrogant superiority, was now contorted into a snarling visage of pure, unadulterated fury. He pointed a perfectly manicured finger directly at the stoic old veteran standing by the doors. "You pathetic, delusional old fool," Julian laughed mercilessly, his cruel voice piercing the tense silence of the room. "You do not even have $50 to your miserable name. You came in here off the streets just to get free heating, so you would not freeze to death in an alleyway. I own entire countries. I own the very banks that hold a mortgage on whatever pathetic cardboard box you sleep, and do not dare to insult my intelligence by pretending you can sit at the king's table." The other wealthy elites in the room, the billionaire heiresses and the corrupt oil tycoons, began to laugh and chuckle, mocking the ragged veteran like a pack of hyenas. "Look at his disgusting cheap coat," one millionaire whispered, loudly adjusting his silk cravat. "He looks like he has not showered in a full week." Another laughed, cruelty dripping from every word. "Why has security not beaten him unconscious?" Yet a wealthy socialite scoffed, sipping her expensive wine. But the wealthy auctioneer standing at the mahogany podium was not laughing with them. He was staring directly at the serial number printed in thick black ink on the back of Elias' worn wooden bidding paddle. The number was 001. The auctioneer suddenly turned ghostly pale, sweat beading profusely on his forehead as his hand began to tremble so violently he almost dropped his microphone. He knew exactly what that classified number meant. That specific serial number was exclusively reserved for the anonymous founder and majority shareholder of the Continental Reserve Bank, the single wealthiest and most powerful individual in the entire hemisphere. The auctioneer gulped hard, feeling the blood drain from his face as he realized that the ragged, homeless-looking man standing in the back of the room could buy and sell every single arrogant billionaire in this auction house 10 times over without even checking his bank balance. Julian, completely ignorant of the auctioneer's sudden paralyzing panic, slapped his hand down hard on the back of his velvet chair. $60 million, Julian barked, his massive ego completely taking over his rational thought. "I will not lose a bidding war to a filthy street rat who cannot even afford a proper shave. Kick him out right now, auctioneer, or I swear to you I will buy this entire auction house tomorrow morning and have you fired and blacklisted from the industry for the rest of your miserable life." Julian Vance had spent his entire existence crushing innocent, vulnerable people to build his massive, unsinkable tech empire. Just last month, he had executed a hostile takeover of a small, struggling pediatric cancer research facility just to demolish the buildings and turn the land into a private, exclusive golf course, leaving dozens of sick, terminally ill children without critical funding or care. He truly believed that his vast wealth made him an untouchable god among men, and that poor people were nothing more than disposable resources to be used and thrown away. He thought this auction would be just another display of his absolute, unquestioned dominance over the city. But he had absolutely no idea who he was dealing with. Elias had spent 50 years in the darkest, bloodiest trenches of the world, commanding classified special forces units and building a tactical financial empire in the shadows, while men like Julian were playing with Daddy's trust fund money. Elias did not care about flashy diamonds, expensive sports cars, or designer clothing. He cared about true honor, unbreakable loyalty, and protecting the innocent from predators. and he absolutely despised arrogant men like Julian, who cowardly used their wealth as a weapon against those who could not fight back. Elias ignored the two terrified security guards standing next to him and slowly began to walk down the center aisle of the massive glowing auction hall. Every single step he took was heavy and highly deliberate, his muddy scuffed combat boots thudding rhythmically against the pristine red carpet like the steady lethal beat of a war drum. The arrogant billionaires sitting in their pews shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their laughter dying in their throats as the intense suffocating aura of the battle-hardened veteran washed over them like a tidal wave. Elias stopped exactly 2 feet away from Julian Vance in the front row. The young, ruthless tech mogul tried desperately to maintain his arrogant, cruel smirk, but he could feel a terrifying, uncontrollable predatory energy radiating from the old man standing before him. "You truly think your wealth makes you an untouchable god boy," Elias rasped, his pale blue eyes blaze with quiet, but absolutely lethal intensity that seemed to suck the oxygen out of the room. "You think wearing a $10,000 silk tie and a diamond watch hides the fact that you are a weak, pathetic coward who destroys children's hospitals just for sport." Julian took a nervous, involuntary step back, his heart skipping a beat, as he wondered how this beggar knew about the cancer ward takeover, but his massive, fragile ego forced him to compensate and attack. "I earned my empire, you ragged piece of trash," Julian spat, his face reddening and contorting in defensive anger. "I bid $60 million, auctioneer. I demand you finish the sale immediately before I call the police and have this lunatic arrested for criminal trespassing and harassment." The pale, sweating auctioneer looked at Julian with a mixture of absolute pity and horror before turning his reverent, terrified gaze back to Elias. "I am so very sorry, Mr. Vance," the auctioneer said, his voice shaking uncontrollably over the microphone echoing off the walls. "But this gentleman has already pre-authorized an unlimited open bidding account, and he is fully cleared by the Global Reserve to bid on any item in this building regardless of the price." Julian froze instantly, his arrogant smirk completely and utterly vanishing from his face, replaced by a look of utter confusion. "What in the hell did you just say?" Julian whispered, his voice barely audible over the sound of his own racing heart. Elias calmly raised his worn wooden paddle one more time, locking eyes with the shattered tech mogul. $100 million, Elias stated, his deep voice ringing out through the dead silent room like a lethal death knell. "And I am buying the pediatric cancer facility you demolished last month, along with it, just so I can rebuild it from the ground up and erase your miserable name from its history." The echo of the words $100 million rang through the grand Elias auction house like a deafening thunderclap, shattering the fragile illusion of supremacy that every single billionaire in the room held so dear. For exactly 10 seconds, there was no sound except for the relentless howling of the freezing winter storm battering against the massive stained glass windows high above. Then the chaos began. The crowd of ultra-wealthy elites who just moments ago were mercilessly mocking the ragged veteran suddenly descended into a frenzied chorus of panic whispers and terrified gasps. A billionaire heiress sitting in the second row involuntarily dropped her crystal champagne flute, sending shards of expensive glass scattering across the red carpet. A corrupt oil tycoon choked on his imported Cuban cigar, coughing violently as he stared at the muddy boots of the old man in pure disbelief. $100 million was more liquid cash than most of these arrogant moguls had in their entire combined offshore accounts, and this ragged, homeless-looking man had just casually dropped it like it was loose pocket change found in the cushions of a cheap sofa. In the front row, Julian Vance was experiencing a complete and total psychological breakdown. His breathing became rapid, heavy, and erratic, his chest heaving under his expensive midnight blue tuxedo, which suddenly felt like a suffocating straitjacket, conflicting with his racing heart. Cold sweat began to pour down his pale face, completely ruining his perfectly slicked back hair as the reality of the situation threatened to shatter his massive, fragile ego. "This is a bluff," Julian shrieked, his voice cracking higher-pitched and pathetic in absolute panic. "He is a fraud, a con artist, a pathetic liar auctioneer. I demand you arrest him immediately, check his accounts, run his credentials. He does not have that money. Nobody walking off the street in a disgusting damp coat has that kind of money. It is a physical impossibility. It is a complete lie." The terrified auctioneer, whose hands were still shaking violently, did not look at Julian. Instead, he pressed a heavy brass button on his mahogany podium, causing the massive velvet curtains behind the stage to part, revealing a gigantic 90-inch digital LED mainframe display screen. so that every single elite member in the room could see the financial verification process in real time. The auctioneer typed in the classified serial number 001 from the back of Elias' worn wooden paddle, his fingers trembling over the keyboard. Julian crossed his arms, smirking desperately, trying to convince himself that this was all an elaborate prank, that in just a few seconds the screen would flash red, and the disgusting old veteran would be dragged out into the gutter by the armed guards. But Julian was dead wrong. The massive LED screen did not flash red with a decline notice. Instead, it emitted a blinding solid neon green light, illuminating the entire auction house in an eerie verdant glow. On the center of the screen, the massive golden crest of the Continental Reserve Bank appeared, accompanied by a Tier 1 Department of Defense authorization seal that instantly bypassed every single civilian financial security protocol in the global banking system. Underneath the glowing golden crest in massive bold letters, read the words account status, unlimited, authorized, and cleared for immediate transfer. The entire room collectively stopped breathing. Julian's knees visibly buckled, his expensive Italian leather shoes slipping slightly on the carpet as he stared at the massive glowing screen in pure paralyzing horror. He realized in that exact devastating moment that the man he had just brutally humiliated was not just a wealthy investor. He was a financial apex predator of the entire world, a man who held the global economy, Indiana, the palm of his scarred, callous hands. Desperation clawed at Julian's throat. His ego would simply not allow him to accept defeat from a man who looked like a peasant. He frantically reached into his tuxedo pocket and pulled out his custom, encrypted titanium smartphone, his thumbs flying across the screen as he dialed his private hedge fund manager. "Pick up the phone, you idiot, pick up the phone," Julian hissed, through gritted teeth, his eyes darting paranoidly around the room as the other billionaires watched his pathetic meltdown. When the manager finally answered, Julian did not even give him a chance to speak. "Liquidate everything," Julian screamed into the phone, completely abandoning any pretense of professionalism or calm. "Sell the overseas assets, drain the offshore shell accounts, empty the corporate reserve funds. I need $150 million in liquid capital routed to my auction account. Right this exact second, do it now, or I will personally destroy your entire bloodline." But there was no sound of typing or compliance on the other end of the line. There was only the sound of the hedge fund manager weeping softly. "I cannot do it, Mr. Vance," the manager sobbed, his voice filled with absolute despair. "We are locked out, sir. Every single one of our accounts has been frozen by a Tier 1 directive from the Continental Reserve. You have absolutely nothing left, sir. We are completely finished." Julian's smartphone slipped from his sweaty, trembling grip, falling in slow motion and shattering against the pristine red carpet. He was not just losing an auction, he was losing his entire existence. Elias, who had not moved a single inch during Julian's entire pathetic panic attack, simply watched the young tech mogul crumble with dead, cold, unblinking eyes. Elias slowly reached up with his heavily scarred hands grasping the top button of his damp, ragged gray wool coat. The arrogant billionaires in the crowd leaned forward in their seats, their eyes wide with anticipation, unable to look away from the spectacle unfolding before them. As Elias unbuttoned the thick wool material, he spoke again, his gravelly voice cutting through Julian's panic like a hot serrated scalpel through soft butter. "You spent your entire pathetic life building a tower of paper money, boy," Elias whispered, stepping 1 inch closer to the trembling billionaire. "You are behind lawyers and bank accounts and expensive suits, and you convinced yourself that you were a king. But paper burns, Vance. And when the fire comes, men like you always turn to ash because you have absolutely no iron in your spine." Elias gripped the lapels of his disgusting damp coat, and with one fluid, highly deliberate motion, he pulled it off his broad shoulders, letting the heavy wet wool fall heavily to the pristine red carpet with a resounding dull thud that echoed through the silent room. As the coat dropped to the floor, the harsh, cold blue lighting that had been illuminating the auction house was suddenly and inexplicably replaced by a massive surge of warm golden cinematic lighting that showered down from the massive crystal chandeliers, bathing Elias in a radiant glow. Underneath the dirt-stained, ruined coat, Elias was not wearing a cheap off-the-rack suit or rag street clothes. He was wearing the flawless, pristine, heavily starched dress uniform of a 5-star combat general in the United States military. The deep blue fabric of the uniform was immaculate, not a single thread out of place, but it was what was pinned to the chest that brought the entire room of billionaires to their knees. Dozens upon dozens of shining golden medals of honor, heavy bronze stars, purple hearts with oak leaf clusters, and shimmering navy crosses covered his broad chest, glinting blindingly in the warm overhead light, like a constellation of pure unyielding heroism. Several older retired military officers who had been sitting quietly in the back rows of the elite crowd immediately stood up from their chairs, their spines snapping ramrod straight, as they rendered sharp, flawless salutes to the living, breathing legend standing in the center aisle. Julian Vance, the once arrogant and untouchable tech mogul, was now trembling so violently that his teeth were audibly chattering his expensive midnight blue tuxedo, now feeling like a burning prison. As he looked up at the terrifying god of war, he had just mercilessly and publicly mocked. The entire Grand Aurelius auction house remained trapped in a state of absolute paralyzing shock as General Elias stood, like a titan, in the dead center of the aisle. The shimmering golden medals on his broad chest told the harrowing stories of supreme sacrifice and unimaginable bravery that none of the pampered elites in this room could ever possibly comprehend. Julian Vance, the once fearless and untouchable billionaire tech mogul, was now shrinking backward in his plush crimson velvet chair, his expensive Italian leather shoes pathetically scuffing against the pristine red carpet as his entire empire of arrogance crumbled into microscopic dust before his very eyes. Elias took one more slow, highly deliberate step forward, the heavy golden medals clinking softly against his pristine starched uniform. That metallic sound was barely a whisper, yet it struck pure, unadulterated primal terror into Julian's heart, echoing in his ears like the deafening roar of an artillery strike. "You asked me if I came in here off the freezing streets just to get free heating," Elias whispered, his gravelly voice saturated with the heavy, crushing weight of absolute authority. "I did not come in here for the heat, boy. I came in here to bring the fire and to buy back the precious history that you were about to mercilessly destroy with your endless, sickening greed." Elias slowly turned his gaze away from the quivering mogul and looked out over the crowd of terrified billionaires, all of whom were now desperately avoiding his piercing predatory stare, completely shamed by their earlier cruel laughter. "You all sit in these plush velvet chairs wearing diamonds that could feed entire starving cities for a decade, and you truly think your fat bank accounts make you untouchable gods among men." Elias continued, his voice rising steadily with a righteous consuming fury that made the massive crystal chandeliers shake. "You foolishly equate your wealth with your worth, but I have seen real men bleed to death in the freezing mud defending the very freedom that allows you all to sit here in luxury and sneer at the rest of the world. I have held 18-year-old boys in my arms as they took their final gurgling breaths, boys who had absolutely nothing to their names but the unbreakable honor in their brave hearts and the military rifles in their muddy hands. That is true currency, that is true unyielding wealth that no bank can ever hold. Wealth without character is just dead, useless paper sitting in a dark vault, and a man without empathy is nothing more than a disgusting parasite feeding on the vulnerable and the weak." Elias slowly turned his blazing pale blue eyes back to Julian, who was now weeping silently, large pathetic tears streaming down his face, completely ruining his perfectly slicked back hair and his expensive imported cologne. "You thought you could crush a children's cancer ward just to build a stupid private golf course, and you thought there'd be absolutely no consequences." Elias rasped, stepping so intimately close that Julian could literally feel the cold, deadly aura radiating off the bronze stars. "I am the consequence, Vance, and I have come to collect your soul." Julian desperately tried to stammer out a pathetic apology, his cowardly, weak voice cracking like a frightened child's. "Please, General, I was so wrong. I swear I did not know who you were. I can fix all of this. I will give you the historic workshops for free. Just please do not ruin my company. I beg you," Julian pleaded, dropping from his velvet chair straight onto his knees on the pristine red carpet in front of the entire watching crowd, completely and utterly surrendering every last ounce of his shattered dignity. Elias looked down at the groveling, broken mogul with a look of absolute lethal disgust. "It is far too late for your empty, pathetic apologies, boy," Elias said calmly as he reached into his pristine uniform pocket and pulled out a heavy, secure military-grade titanium smartphone. "While you were busy laughing at my cheap damp coat and ordering your armed goons to throw me into the gutter, I was silently having my Tier 1 board of directors at the Continental Reserve digitally acquire every single outstanding debt and high-risk loan your vast megacorporation currently owes. You greedily over-leveraged your entire life to build that lifeless, ugly tech tower yours, and as of exactly 3 minutes ago, I personally called in every single one of your loans effective immediately, without any grace period. The two massive security guards who had tried to drag Elias out of the room just moments before now stood frozen in absolute terror, suddenly realizing that the man they were hired to protect was now officially the poorest man in the entire building. Julian let out a gurgling choke as he realized his private jet, his multiple mansions, his luxury supercars, and his entire identity were being systematically wiped from existence by a man he had deemed unworthy of breathing the same air. "You are completely bankrupt," Vance, Elias stated coldly, putting his titanium phone back into his uniform pocket. "Your skyscrapers foreclosed, your offshore accounts are permanently seized, and your exclusive membership to this high-end auction house is permanently revoked. You came walking in here tonight treating innocent people like disposable trash, and now you are leaving this building with absolutely nothing but that cheap tuxedo on your trembling back." The pale auctioneer, who was still gripping the mahogany podium for dear life, finally found his voice and slammed the heavy wooden gavel down with a deafening crack that sounded like a gunshot. "Sold for exactly $100 million to General Elias," the auctioneer declared, his voice shaking, but filled with absolute reverence and profound relief. The sound of the heavy wooden gavel crashing against the mahogany podium seemed to linger in the air for an eternity, a final devastating punctuation mark on the complete and utter destruction of Julian Vance's once unsinkable megacorporate empire. The two massive, heavily muscled security guards who just minutes prior had been fully prepared to brutally drag General Elias out into the freezing storm now slowly turned their cold, unfeeling attention toward the groveling, weeping former billionaire still kneeling pathetically on the pristine red carpet. They had spent years working for men like Julian men, who treated them like disposable hired muscle men, who spoke to them as if they were beneath dirt. But now the power dynamic had shifted so violently that the guards actually felt a surge of dark satisfaction. Without uttering a single word, the first guard reached down with his thick tree trunk-like arms and grabbed the collar of Julian's expensive custom-tailored midnight blue tuxedo, yanking the shattered tech mogul off the floor with such brutal force that the seams of the $1,000 jacket audibly ripped. "No, please, you cannot do this to me. I am a VIP. I own half the city," Julian shrieked, his voice cracking into a high-pitched hysterical wail as he frantically kicked his expensive Italian leather shoes in the air like a terrified tantrum-throwing child. The second guard grabbed Julian's other arm, securing him in a crushing vice grip, completely ignoring the former mogul's pathetic pleas, as they began to drag him backward down the long center aisle of the Grand Elias auction house. Every single elite member of the crowd, every billionaire heiress, every corrupt tycoon, every arrogant socialite who had laughed at Elias earlier now sat in dead, absolute silence, watching the ultimate spectacle of instant karma unfold before their very eyes. No one stood up to defend Julian. No one offered a single word of protest. In the cutthroat world of the ultra-rich, loyalty was only as deep as a bank account, and Julian's bank account was now a smoking digital crater. As the guards dragged him past the rows of plush crimson velvet chairs, Julian reached out with his manicured hands, desperately grabbing at the suit jackets of his former business partners and golfing buddies, begging them for help, but they all violently pulled away from him, as if he were infected with a highly contagious lethal virus. "Please, Richard, do something, help me pay them off," Julian sobbed, reaching for a wealthy investor, but the investor simply turned his head away, refusing to even make eye contact with the fallen mogul, not wanting to risk drawing the wrath of the terrifying five-star general standing stoically at the front of the room. The guards dragged Julian all the way to the massive heavy brass double doors at the entrance of the auction house. With one coordinated effort, they kicked the doors wide open, exposing the opulent, warm, glowing interior to the brutal, howling, freezing winter rainstorm raging outside in the dark city streets. "You belong in the gutter, Vance," the first security guard growled, echoing the exact words Julian had used against Elias just moments ago, before both guards mercilessly hurled the shattered former billionaire down the marble steps out into the unforgiving cold. Julian hit the wet asphalt hard, skidding across the freezing puddles, scraping his hands and tearing his expensive tuxedo pants. He lay there in the freezing mud, gasping for air, the icy rain pelting against his face and completely washing away the last traces of his expensive cologne and arrogant pride as the heavy brass doors of the auction house slammed shut behind him, locking him out in the cold forever with absolutely nothing but the wet clothes on his back and the crushing weight of his own sickening regret. Back inside the opulent hall, the echo of the slamming doors signaled the absolute end of Julian Vance's reign of terror. The harsh winter wind was cut off, replaced once again by the silent, suffocating tension of the wealthy crowd reckoning with the presence of true, unstoppable power. General Elias had not turned around to watch Julian's humiliating exit. He remained standing in the center of the room, the warm golden cinematic lighting from the crystal chandeliers continuing to reflect brilliantly off the dozens of heavy metals on his pristine starched uniform. He slowly exhaled a deep control breath and turned his gaze back toward the stage where the pale, trembling auctioneer was still clutching the mahogany podium as if it were a life raft in a violent ocean storm. Elias began to walk toward the stage, his scuffed, muddy combat boots the only sound in the entire massive hall, every step reinforcing the absolute dominance he now held over every single soul in the building. The auctioneer hurriedly scrambled to gather the heavy parchment deed to the historic harbor workshops, his sweaty hands fumbling with the expensive fountain pen as he prepared the final transfer documents. Elias reached the stage, and instead of walking around to the stairs, he simply placed his heavily scarred, calloused hands on the edge of the platform and effortlessly vaulted himself up, showcasing a terrifying level of physical combat fitness that belied his 65 years of age. He walked directly up to the podium, looming over the terrified auctioneer, who instantly stepped back and bowed his head in deep, unwavering submission. "Gee, General Elias, sir," the auctioneer stammered, his voice barely a wisp of the documents, "are all completely prepared, and the digital transfer of the $100 million has already cleared the global reserve protocols. The harbor workshops are now entirely yours, sir. I cannot apologize enough for the disrespect you were shown earlier by that man." Elias did not acknowledge the apology. He did not care about the auctioneer's cowardly attempt at appeasement. He reached into the pocket of his pristine uniform and slowly pulled out the small, crumpled, faded photograph of his late wife, Mary. He gently smoothed out the creases with his thick combat-hardened thumb, his blazing pale blue eyes softening for the very first time that evening. He carefully placed the old photograph down on the mahogany podium right next to the $1 million transfer documents and the parchment deed. He leaned forward, resting his weight on his hands, as he looked down at the beautiful, smiling face of the woman who had waited for him through dozens of brutal classified deployments, the woman who had loved him when he had nothing but a dirt on his face and the rifle slung across his back. "I told you I would detect it," Mary Elias whispered, his gravelly voice barely audible over the sound of his own beating heart, a single solitary tear escaping his stoic, dead calm eyes and tracing a path down his wrinkled, scarred cheek before dropping onto the wooden podium. "I told you no one would ever tear down our home, and I meant it." The single tear that fell from the eye of the battle-hardened general seemed to carry more weight than every single ounce of gold in the entire Continental Reserve, and as it soaked into the dry, ancient parchment of the property deed, it sealed a promise that had been forged in the deadly fires of war and sanctified in the blood of countless classified deployments. The trembling auctioneer, who was standing only inches away, held his breath, completely terrified to make even the slightest sound as the five-star general experienced this profoundly private moment of grief and triumph. Elias slowly lifted his head, his blazing pale blue eyes hardening once again into the deadly impenetrable glare of a Tier 1 apex predator. He reached out with his scarred, calloused right hand and picked up the heavy, expensive gold-plated fountain pen that was resting on a mahogany podium. He did not hesitate for a single fraction of a second as he pressed the nib to the parchment and signed his classified authorization cipher on the dotted line, officially and irrevocably transferring the total ownership of the historic harbor workshops, along with the recently demolished pediatric cancer facility, directly into his fully protected global trust. He dropped the heavy gold pen onto the podium with a sharp metallic clack that made the auctioneer visibly flinch. Elias carefully picked up the crumpled photograph of his late wife, sliding it safely back into the inner breast pocket of his pristine starched military uniform right next to his beating heart before he turned his massive broad shoulders to face the terrified crowd of assembled billionaires one final time. The entire Grand Aurelius auction house was so suffocatingly silent that the only discernible sound was the collective rapid heartbeats of 100 arrogant elites who were all holding their breath in pure primal fear. Elias looked out over the sea of expensive bespoke tuxedos, designer silk gowns, and $1 million diamond necklaces, his gaze sweeping across the room like the targeting laser of a lethal sniper rifle. This city has been run by merciless predators for far too long, Elias rasped, his gravelly, deep voice projecting to the massive hall without the need for any microphone. You have all grown fat and complacent feasting on the bones of the working class, stealing from the vulnerable and hiding behind your highly paid corporate lawyers and your shadow offshore shell accounts. You all watch Julian Vance destroy countless innocent lives, and instead of stopping him, you clink your expensive champagne glasses and beg for a piece of his profit. Elias took a slow, deliberate step right to the edge of the elevated stage, looming over the front row of billionaires like an avenging angel of death. Well, the era of the parasite is officially over. Elias declared, his voice dropping to a terrifying predatory growl that sent ice-cold shivers down the spines of every single corrupt tycoon in the building. As of tonight, the Continental Reserve is initiating a full global audit of every single corporate entity represented in this very room. If I find out that any of you have illegally evicted a struggling family, if I discover that any of you have defrauded a workers' pension fund, or I even hear a whisper that you have used your wealth to crush someone who could not defend themselves, I will not just bankrupt you like I did to Vance. I will systematically dismantle your entire existence and bury your legacies so deep in the ground that your own grandchildren will pretend they never knew your names. Consider this your one and only warning. The room of elites collectively shuddered, several wealthy CEOs visibly swallowing hard as they mentally calculated the massive illegal corporate crimes they had committed and the imminent devastating wrath that was now coming for them. Elias did not wait for a response. He did not crave their validation or their fear. He simply demanded their absolute compliance. He stepped down from the stage, his scuffed combat boots hitting the pristine red carpet with a heavy thud. As he began to walk back down the center aisle toward the massive heavy brass doors, an incredible phenomenon occurred. The crowd of ultra-wealthy billionaires who usually demanded that the world part for them now scrambled backward in their plush velvet chairs, desperately pulling their expensive leather shoes out of the aisle, terrified that even brushing against the general's pristine uniform would condemn them. They parted like the Red Sea, cowering in the presence of true, unstoppable power. The retired military officers in the back rows who had saluted him earlier once again snapped to flawless, strict military attention, holding their salutes with tears of pride forming in their eyes as the legendary ghost operator walked past them, his heavy golden medals continuing to clink with every single deliberate step. Elias reached the entrance where the two massive security guards were standing frozen in awe. One of the guards frantically reached out with his thick, trembling hands and pulled the heavy brass doors wide open, allowing the brutal freezing rain and the howling winter wind to once again rush into the opulent, glowing lobby. Elias stepped out into the destructive storm without a single ounce of hesitation. The freezing rain immediately began to pelt against his pristine starch uniform, but he did not shiver. He did not hunch his shoulders, and he did not seek shelter. He had survived monsoons and classified jungle warfare and freezing blizzards on Black Site Mountain peaks. This city storm was nothing but a light drizzle to a man forged in hell. As he walked down the marble steps, his sharp pale blue eyes glanced toward the dark muddy gutter near the road. Lying there completely soaked, shivering violently, and covered in filthy street mud was Julian Vance. The once arrogant billionaire was curled into a pathetic fetal position, his ruined designer tuxedo clinging to his weak, trembling frame, weeping hysterically as he clutched his shattered titanium smartphone. Julian looked up through the pouring rain, his eyes wide with pure, utter despair, as he saw the magnificent glowing figure of General Elias standing tall and unbroken in the storm. Elias did not say a single word to the broken man. He did not gloat, and he did not taunt him, because lions do not waste their time conversing with crushed insects. Suddenly, the deafening roar of massive heavy-duty diesel engines echoed through the rain-swept street, cutting to the sound of the howling wind. Four massive matte black armor-plated tactical assault SUVs with heavily tinted bulletproof windows turned the corner and approached the auction house, their blinding white lead headlights cutting through the dark storm. The convoys slammed on their brakes, forming a perfect protective perimeter around General Elias. The heavy armored doors of the vehicles swung open in perfect synchronization, and 12 elite, highly trained Tier 1 Ghost operators wearing matte black tactical gear and carrying suppressed assault rifles stepped out into the rain. They did not speak a word. They simply formed a wall of lethal, impenetrable human armor around Elias and snapped a crisp, unified salute. The lead operator, a massive scar man, opened the rear door of the command SUV and bowed his head slightly. "Perimeter is secure," commanded the operator said over the sound of the rain. "Your target destination at the harbor workshops is awaiting your arrival." Elias gave a single sharp nod, adjusting his posture as he climbed into the warm, high-tech interior of the armored vehicle, leaving the shattered, weeping remains of Julian Vance behind in the gutter, exactly where he belonged, as the heavy doors slammed shut and the tactical convoy sped off into the dark night, ready to execute the next phase of their massive operation. The heavy armored tactical convoy tore through the flooded city streets like a pack of black metallic wolves, cutting through the brutal winter storm with absolute lethal precision. Inside the command SUV, the atmosphere was dead silent except for the low hum of the military-grade, encrypted radios, and the steady, relentless beating of the freezing rain against the thick, bulletproof glass. General Elias sat in the back seat, his blazing pale blue eyes staring out into the darkness, watching the glittering, corrupt financial district slowly fade away, replaced by the gritty, weathered industrial borders of the city. They were approaching the harbor district, a place that had been systematically abandoned by the elite and left to rot, yet it still held the beating heart and soul of the working class. The massive diesel engines growled as the convoy turned onto cobblestone streets, approaching the historic harbor workshops. The buildings loomed in the darkness, massive structures of ancient red brick and heavy iron weathered by over a century of brutal harbor storms and merciless corporate neglect. Inside those brick walls, dozens of struggling artisans, mechanics, and vulnerable families were currently huddled around cheap electric heaters, completely terrified because they had all watched the news that morning. They all knew about the auction, and they fully expected Julian Vance's ruthless corporate thugs to kick the doors down tonight and drag them out into the freezing rain to demolish their homes. The convoy came to a sudden halt in the center of the massive courtyard, the blinding white lead headlights illuminating the cracked brick facades, and the faded hand-painted signs over the workshop doors. Instantly, the heavy armored doors of the tactical vehicles swung open, and the 12 Tier 1 Ghost operators deployed with devastating efficiency. They moved like shadows in the rain, their suppressed assault rifles raised as they secured every single entrance, exit, and rooftop vantage point, in a matter of seconds scanning the perimeter with high-powered thermal optics to ensure that none of Vance's lingering enforcers were lurking in the dark alleyways. Once the perimeter was locked down with impenetrable tactical precision, the lead operator opened the rear door for Elias. The 5-star general stepped out into the storm once again, his pristine uniform contrasting sharply with the gritty, muddy courtyard. He walked directly toward the massive heavy iron doors of the main warehouse, where a flickering yellow light was spilling out through the cracked frosted glass windows. Elias reached out with his heavily scarred hand and pushed the heavy doors, opened the rusty hinges, screeching loudly, piercing the tense silence of the night. Inside the vast, drafty warehouse, the air was thick with the smell of sawdust, motor oil, and pure desperation. Over 50 people, men, women, and terrified children flinched and backed away into the shadows as the doors swung open. When they saw the massive, shadowy figures of the heavily armed tactical operators standing outside in the pouring rain, several of the mothers began to weep silently, pulling their children closer, believing that the merciless corporate eviction squad had finally arrived to destroy their lives. An old man named Thomas, whose hands were permanently stained with decades of thick engine grease, slowly stepped forward to protect his people, his legs trembling, but his jaw set with absolute defiance. He gripped a heavy steel wrench in his hand, fully prepared to go down swinging against the corporate monsters to defend his sick wife and his grandchildren. "We are not leaving this building without a massive fight," Thomas shouted, his voice cracking with age and fear. "We built this entire place with our own blood and sweat. You tell your arrogant boss Vance that he will have to bury you as under the rubble before we ever surrender our homes to his sickening greed." Elias stepped through the doorway out of the darkness and into the flickering yellow light of the warm warehouse. He calmly reached up with both scarred hands and removed his starched military cap, revealing his gray hair and his stoic, combat-hardened face. He looked at Thomas, the old grease-stained mechanic, and his deadly pale blue eyes instantly softened with deep, profound respect and empathy. He did not see a nuisance or a trespasser. He saw a fellow brave soldier fighting desperately to protect his fragile people. Elias slowly raised his empty, bare hands to show everyone he was not there to bring violence or destruction. "I am not here on behalf of Julian Vance," Elias said, his deep, gravelly voice resonating through the drafty warehouse like a calming, unbreakable anchor in a violent ocean storm. "Julian Vance no longer has a voice in this city, and he certainly has absolutely no power over this historic harbor. Vance is currently freezing in a filthy, muddy gutter. Outside the Grand Aurelius auction house with $0 to the pathetic name, and a fleet of ruthless federal auditors systematically dismantling his entire pathetic life. The terrified crowd of families and workers froze in place, their eyes widening in shock and disbelief as they desperately tried to comprehend the massive, incredible paradigm shift that was happening right in front of them. Thomas lowered his heavy steel wrench, his breath catching in his dry throat, as he looked at the heavy golden medals of honor shining brilliantly on Elias' chest, and realized that this was not a merciless corporate enforcer, this was a highly decorated war hero. Who are you, Thomas? Whispered, his eyes wide with awe and complete confusion. What is going to happen to all of us? Are we being evicted by the bank in the morning? Elias reached into the breast pocket of his pristine starched uniform and slowly pulled out the heavy parchment deed that he had just signed at the auction house minutes ago, along with a faded, crumpled photograph of his late wife, Mary. He walked closer to Thomas and gently held out the valuable deed for the old mechanic to see. No one is evicting you or your families. Elias rasped his voice thick with raw, unfiltered emotion. I just bought this entire workshop district in cash. I bought it so that not a single historic brick in this warehouse will ever be touched by a corporate wrecking ball. My late wife, Mary, grew up running through these exact halls. She learned how to paint in that very corner over there, and she taught me how to find peace in this courtyard before I was deployed into the deadly trenches of the Tier 1 black sites. I swore on her grave that I would protect her beautiful legacy from monsters like Vance, and by God, I'm going to keep that sacred promise until I draw my very last breath. The entire warehouse instantly erupted into a chorus of shocked gasps, followed immediately by the sound of overwhelming pure relief and profound hysterical weeping. Exhausted mothers dropped to their knees on the concrete floor, hugging their crying children so tightly as the crushing, suffocating weight of impending homelessness was instantly and permanently lifted from their weak shoulders. Hardened mechanics and gritty artisans who had not shed a single tear in decades broke down, crying, embracing each other as the absolute miracle they had been desperately praying for finally manifested in the form of a 5-star general. Thomas dropped the wrench with a loud clang, fell forward, and weakly wrapped his thick grease-stained arms around Elias, pulling the massive Apex commander into a deep, desperate hug, completely ruining the pristine fabric of the military uniform with thick black motor oil. But Elias did not care in the slightest. He hugged the old man back, his heavily scarred hands patting Thomas gently on the back. Tomorrow morning, my tactical financial team is going to establish a multi-million-dollar unbreakable endowment for every single business in this harbor. Elias continued, speaking loudly over the beautiful cries of joy. We are fixing the leaky roofs, we are upgrading the broken heating systems, and we are fully securing your property titles, so that no arrogant, greedy billionaire can ever threaten your beautiful families again. This harbor is officially under my absolute protection now, and anyone who dares to bring their corrupt greed to these iron doors will have to answer directly to me and my tactical operators outside. The warmth that flooded the harbor workshop was no longer just coming from the cheap flickering electric heaters. It was radiating from profound, overwhelming sense of absolute salvation that had just descended upon the struggling families. General Elias did not just stand there basking in their adoration, like some arrogant politician seeking praise. He immediately rolled up the pristine starched sleeves of his decorated military uniform, completely ignoring the thick black motor oil that had already ruined the expensive fabric. He walked directly over to the massive industrial heating unit that had been broken for weeks, leaving the artisans freezing in the winter storm. He kneeled down on the hard, cold concrete floor, his heavy golden medals clinking against the metal casing as he asked Thomas for the heavy steel wrench. The families watched in pure, speechless awe as the billionaire apex predator, the single wealthiest and most dangerous man on the entire planet, expertly dismantled the rusty heating valve with his heavily scarred, callous hands, working side by side with the grease-stained mechanics. Outside in the brutal, howling storm, the massive armored tactical convoy did not remain idle. The 12 Tier 1 Ghost operators began unloading massive military-grade crates from the rear of the assault SUVs. They carried in high-capacity thermal generators, heavy-duty medical supplies, and enough hot, high-quality catered food to feed the entire district for a month. The cold, freezing draft was systematically eliminated as the operators expertly sealed the broken windows and repaired the shattered door frames, moving with the exact same lethal precision they used in classified hostage rescues, only now they were rescuing the neglected souls of the harbor. The lead operator, a massive, intimidating man covered in tactical gear and night vision optics, gently handed a warm blanket and a hot meal to a terrified 7-year-old girl, his deadly demeanor instantly melting into protective kindness. This was the true extent of Elias' power, not just the ability to destroy his enemies with devastating financial strikes, but profound, unyielding capacity to rebuild broken lives with absolute compassion and unbreakable loyalty. Meanwhile, miles away in the heart of the glittering, corrupt financial district, the exact opposite reality was crashing down upon the shattered, pathetic remains of Julian Vance. The once untouchable tech mogul was literally dragging his freezing mud-soaked body through the unforgiving city streets. His expensive custom-tailored midnight blue tuxedo was torn to shreds, clinging to his weak, shivering frame like a wet garbage bag. His designer Italian leather shoes had been lost in a deep freezing puddle, leaving him to limp barefoot across the freezing, jagged asphalt. Every single step was pure agonizing torment, but he pushed forward, driven by the delusional, desperate hope that he could somehow salvage his empire. He finally reached the base of the Vance Technologies Tower, a massive 90-story behemoth of cold, lifeless glass and steel they had built by mercilessly crushing dozens of small businesses. He stumbled toward the massive revolving glass doors, expecting the heavily armed private security detail to rush forward and assist him. But as he slapped his muddy, bleeding hands against the recognition scanner, the heavy doors did not open. Instead, the digital intercom emitted a harsh, loud rejection buzz. Julian frantically wiped the mud from his face and pressed his eye against the retinal scanner, weeping hysterically as he screamed into the microphone. "Let me in, you idiots. It is me, Julian Vance. I own this building. I own all of you. Open these doors right now, before I have you all executed." But the security guards standing in the warm, glowing lobby did not move to help him. They simply stood there staring at him with cold, unfeeling eyes, the exact same eyes he had used to look at the vulnerable for his entire pathetic life. Suddenly, the main door slid open, but it was not to welcome him inside. A team of 4 sharply dressed, ruthless corporate auditors, wearing the insignia of the Continental Reserve Bank, stepped out into freezing rain, flanked by heavily armed federal marshals. The lead auditor, a cold, calculating woman with a tablet in her hand, looked down at the groveling, shivering mogul with absolute lethal disgust. "You do not own this building anymore, Mr. Vance," the auditor stated, her voice devoid of any empathy or mercy. As of 20 minutes ago, this entire megastructure, every server, every patent, and every single cent in the corporate vaults was officially foreclosed and seized by the Continental Reserve Bank to cover your massive illegal debts. Your cars have been confiscated, your penthouse has been raided, and your passport has been permanently revoked by the federal government, pending a massive multi-agency criminal investigation into your shadow offshore accounts. Julian fell backward onto the freezing, wet concrete, his shattered mind completely unable to comprehend the sheer velocity of his total annihilation. No, this is illegal. You cannot just take my empire in one night. I demand to speak to my lawyers," Julian sobbed, pathetically spitting mud and rainwater. "Your lawyers all resigned and cooperated with the investigators 30 minutes ago," the auditor replied, coldly tapping her digital tablet. "They traded your incriminating emails for total immunity. You have absolutely no one left, Vance. You are a ghost." One of the federal marshals tossed a small, cheap cardboard box at Julian's freezing bare feet. It landed in a puddle, spilling open to reveal a single cheap plastic desk ornament, the only personal belonging they had allowed him to keep from his lavish top-floor office. "Now get off our property before I have you arrested for loitering and vagrancy," the marshal barked, his hand resting heavily on his holstered weapon. The massive glass door slid shut, locking firmly into place as the auditors turned their backs on him, leaving Julian completely alone in the brutal, howling storm. He clutched the cheap plastic desk toy to his chest, sobbing uncontrollably in the dark, wet alleyway, the ultimate instant karma, completely eviscerating his soul. He had spent his entire miserable, sickening life forcing innocent people out into cold with absolutely nothing, and now he was finally exactly where he belonged, destined to be completely forgotten by a world that was already moving on without him. Meanwhile, back at the warm, glowing harbor workshops, General Elias wiped the last smudge of grease from his scarred hands as the massive heating unit finally roared to life, pumping glorious life, saving warmth through the entire warehouse. The families cheered loudly, their faces radiant with pure, unadulterated joy as they watched the man who had saved their entire universe with a single swipe of a golden pen and the unshakable honor of a true warrior. The golden warmth radiating from a newly repaired massive industrial heating unit spread through the entire cavernous warehouse like an unbreakable protective shield, completely banishing the bitter winter chill that had plagued the struggling harbor workshops for months. The tense, suffocating atmosphere of impending doom had been entirely replaced by the beautiful sound of genuine laughter and overwhelming relief. The 12 Tier 1 Ghost operators who just hours ago were prepared to execute lethal force to defend the perimeter were now standing by the heavy military crates, expertly serving hot gourmet meals to the exhausted families. The lead tactical operator, still wearing his full matte black combat armor and night vision helmet, was gently handing out high-yield nutritional packs and warm fleece blankets to the little children, his deadly intimidating presence now acting as the ultimate symbol of absolute safety. Old Thomas, the grease-stained mechanic, sat on a wooden crate, tears streaming down his wrinkled cheeks as he watched his young grandchildren eat a warm, proper meal for the first time in weeks without the constant paralyzing fear of corrupt billionaires threatening to kick their door down. General Elias stood near the massive iron doors, his heavily scarred arms crossed over his pristine starched uniform, watching the scene unfold with his blazing pale blue eyes. He did not want their praise, and he did not want to be worshipped as a savior. He only wanted to ensure that the sacred promise he made his late wife Mary was upheld with unyielding ironclad honor. He reached into his breast pocket one more time, feeling the heavy parchment deed and the crumpled, faded photograph resting safely against his chest. The legacy was officially secure. No corporate wrecking ball would ever touch these historic bricks, and no arrogant tech mogul would ever dare to look down on these hard-working families again. As the exhausted residents began to fall asleep on the warm cots set up by the tactical team, Elias gave a silent, sharp nod to his lead operator. The commander immediately tapped his encrypted earpiece, relaying the final directives to the financial shadow team working overseas. Initiate Phase 3, the lead operator whispered into his communicator, locked down the endowment funds, transfer the full ownership titles directly to the Artisans Union, and begin the immediate demolition of the Vance Technologies glass skyscraper. We are turning that lifeless, ugly tower into a new state-of-the-art pediatric cancer research facility fully funded for the next 100 years. The order was relayed in milliseconds, and half a world away, billions of dollars were rerouted through untraceable, encrypted channels, permanently cementing the greatest transfer of wealth and power the city had ever witnessed. As the night slowly transitioned into morning, the brutal, howling winter storm finally began to break, giving way to a pale, cold gray dawn that crept over the towering silhouettes of the downtown financial district. Miles away from the warm, safe harbor, the harsh morning light illuminated a filthy, trash-filled alleyway behind a disgusting dumpster. Lying there trembling uncontrollably in a puddle of freezing, dirty water was a shattered, pathetic shell of Julian Vance. The former apex predator of the corporate world was now completely unrecognizable. His $1,000 midnight blue tuxedo was shredded into filthy, disgusting rags. His perfectly manicured hands were bleeding and covered in black street grime, and his once arrogant face was hollowed out by a single night of pure, unadulterated terror and starvation. He weakly opened his crusted, bloodshot eyes as the sound of heavy footsteps approached. A squad of uniformed city police officers were walking down the alley, flashlights sweeping across the wet bricks. One of the officers shined his blinding beam directly into Julian's trembling face. "Get up, you filthy vagrant," the officer barked, kicking the bottom of Julian's bare, freezing feet with his heavy boot. "You cannot sleep in this alleyway. Stand up before I cite you for trespassing and loitering." Julian let out a pathetic, gurgling sob, weakly raising his muddy, bleeding hand to shield his eyes from the harsh light. "Why, you do not understand," Julian croaked, his voice barely a squeak, his teeth chattering violently. "I am Julian Vance. I am a multi-billionaire. I own that massive skyscraper. Over there, someone stole my life. You have to arrest the man with the medals. He took everything from me. He took my empire." The two police officers looked at each other and burst into cruel, mocking laughter, the exact same type of laughter Julian had used against Elias at the auction house just 12 hours prior. The ultimate poetic justice was officially complete. "Sure thing, buddy," the officer laughed, mercilessly reaching down and yanking Julian off the wet asphalt by his shredded collar and I am the King of England. Now turn around and put your muddy hands behind your back. There's a massive federal warrant out for a scumbag named Julian Vance for embezzlement and multiple count extreme corporate fraud. So, if you truly think you are him, then you are looking at 40 consecutive years in a maximum security federal prison. Julian's knees buckled as the cold, heavy steel handcuffs ratcheted tightly around his trembling wrists, biting deep into his flesh. As they dragged him out of the alleyway toward the blinking lights of the patrol car, Julian looked up at a massive glowing digital billboard across the street. The news had already broken. The billboard displayed a massive bold headline that read: "The fall of a tyrant, Vance Technologies completely seized mysterious 5-star general purchases entire Harbor District to save struggling families." Underneath the text was a high-resolution satellite image of his beloved glass tower already being boarded up by federal agents. Julian let out a final deafening hysterical scream of pure agony and utter defeat as the police officers shoved his freezing body into the back of the patrol car, slamming the door shut and permanently erasing his pathetic existence from the world, the ultimate price exacted for a lifetime of arrogance. The morning sun finally broke through the heavy gray winter clouds, casting a brilliant warm golden light across the entire city and ushering in the dawn a completely new era. Miles away in the financial district, the once dominant and terrifying Vance Technologies skyscraper was already swarming with heavy demolition crews and federal agents systematically stripping the massive, ugly glass tower of its corrupt identity, preparing to tear it down brick by brick to make way for the new high-tech children's hospital. The name Julian Vance had already been entirely erased from the archives of the elite, replaced only by a cautionary tale of unchecked arrogance and the devastating instant karma that eventually comes for all merciless predators. But down in the historic Harbor District, the atmosphere was the exact opposite of destruction. It was a glorious sound of absolute rebirth. The massive iron doors of the main warehouse were propped wide open, welcoming the fresh, crisp morning air. Inside, the struggling families who had gone to sleep terrified the night before were now waking up to the incredible smell of freshly brewed coffee and warm gourmet breakfast supplied by the Tier 1 ghost operators. The little children were running, laughing, and playing freely in the courtyard, completely oblivious to the massive global shift in power that had saved their lives the night before. They only knew that the scary men in suits were never coming back to hurt them ever again. Old Thomas, the grease-stained mechanic, stood in the doorway of his shop, holding a warm mug of coffee, watching the sunlight reflect off the puddles in the cobblestone street. He looked at his hands, which were still stained with thick motor oil, but for the first time in decades, they were not trembling with the paralyzing fear of corporate eviction. He had a permanent secure lease, a massive endowment for new equipment, and the absolute unshakable protection of the most powerful man on the planet. Thomas looked across the courtyard and saw General Elias standing quietly near a weathered ancient brick wall, overlooking the deep blue waters of the ocean harbor. Elias was no longer wearing his pristine starched military uniform or his heavy golden medals of honor. He had traded the heavy burden of his commander's attire for a simple warm wool sweater and a rugged canvas jacket, looking more like a humble fisherman than a global apex predator. The 12 tactical operators were still present, but they had fallen back into the shadows, standing silently on the rooftops and the perimeter, acting as invisible guardians, ensuring that the peace was absolutely unbreakable. Elias reached out with his heavily scarred, calloused right hand and gently touched the rough texture of the red brick wall. It was the exact spot where his late wife Mary had painted a beautiful small mural of a soaring eagle over 40 years ago, when they were just two broke kids with nothing but a dream and an unbreakable bond. The paint had chipped and faded over the decades, enduring brutal storms and harsh winters, but it was still there, resilient and defiant, just like the memory of the woman who had created it. Elias slowly pulled the crumpled, faded photograph of Mary from his jacket pocket and held it up, comparing her radiant smile to the beautiful sunlit courtyard. The harbor was alive with the sounds of hammers clinking, metal grinding, and children laughing, the true beating heart of city that had been saved from the crushing jaws of unyielding corporate greed. Elias closed his eyes and took a deep, slow breath, inhaling the salty harbor air, feeling a profound, overwhelming sense of peace wash over his battle-scarred soul. He had spent his entire life fighting in the darkest, deadliest trenches of the world, deploying forsaken black sites to neutralize global threats and amassing a shadow empire of unimaginable wealth. But standing here in this quiet courtyard listening To the laughter of rescued children, he realized that this was his greatest and most important victory. He had proved to the entire corrupt financial establishment that true supreme wealth is never measured by the number of zeros in a digital bank account or the height of a lifeless glass skyscraper. True wealth is measured by the lives you protect, the honor you uphold, and the unbreakable loyalty you show to the vulnerable when they have absolutely no one else to defend them. A young little girl, barely 6 years old, holding a small handmade wooden toy, cautiously approached the tall, imposing figure of the general. She tugged gently on the sleeve of his rugged canvas jacket. Elias opened his eyes and looked down, his deadly pale blue eyes instantly softening into warm pools of compassion as he kneeled down on a hard cobblestone to be at her eye level. "Thank you for saving our home," Mr. The little girl whispered, her eyes wide with innocent wonder as she handed him the small carved wooden toy. Elias gently took the gift with his heavily scarred hands, treating it with more reverence and respect than he had ever given to any of his heavy golden medals or his billion-dollar Tier 1 financial deeds. "You are very welcome, little one," Elias rasped his gravelly voice thick with raw, unfiltered emotion as a warm, gentle smile finally broke across his stoic face. "And do not worry, no one is ever going to take it away from you again. I gave my word, and a ghost never breaks his vow." Elias stood back up, slipping the precious wooden toy into his jacket pocket, right next to the crumpled photograph of Mary. He turned to look out over the vast expanse of ocean, watching the shimmering waves dance in the morning light. The storm was officially over. The tyrants had been mercilessly dethroned, the arrogant had been humiliated into absolute oblivion, and the innocent were finally secure under the impenetrable aegis of the greatest commander to ever walk the earth. The legend of the homeless-looking veteran who brought a megacorporation to its knees in a single night would echo through the halls of every elite auction house and corrupt boardroom for a century, reminding every single greedy billionaire that no matter how high they build their paper towers, they're always just one wrong move away from awakening the sleeping titans who hid in plain sight, exacting true justice from the shadows.